Hey guys, Darag here. Last episode from Finland. Just turn this around so you can see. Oh, there we go. Still snowing, deepest snow we've had yet, and that's what happens in Finland in March. It snows. So let me see. Here we go. Bingo. Alright, so this one I said I'd focus on, there's a great low-carb conference called Low Carb Breckenridge, started by a couple of doctors a few years ago now, I think this is their third one, excuse me, and if you go to, one of them's a guy from Melbourne, so if you go to Low Carb Down Under on Facebook, I believe very soon you'll be able to see all these talks one by one, like individual videos. I know they did that last year, so I'm assuming that's what they're going to do this year, 2018. And what I've done is I've gone through the talks. I went through the whole series, and because on Diet Doctor on the membership site, because they filmed it, you can actually go and they've just done the whole thing. Like there's about 6 to 8 hours of video, and you've got to find your way through the gaps and all that kind of stuff, and where they've just let the screen run and no one's talking. But they've put a timeline there as well, make it easier. So I went through that and just basically picked out the points of the highlights, because once you've had enough education and had enough experience, what happens is you build a certain body of what I call experiential knowledge, and that's what really counts. And then it's just about building on that as you go. And we're all really doing that. Like if you read Good Calories, Bad Calories by Gary Taubes, you'll appreciate, and I think Nina Teicholz talks about it in Big Fat Surprise as well, how our ideas around diet changed so much because of the Second World War. And you'd wonder why on earth that was. Well, in the Second World War, a lot of the Austrians and Germans were starting to learn what we're teaching now with this low-carb, high-fat movement. And but with the war, no one wanted to speak German anymore, and all the basic science came out of Germany. So it's fascinating that actually put the kibosh really on us, moving ahead. We actually moved back. We regressed because of that whole shift and getting rid of science and having that whole war affect us, emotionally, as well as, all that research was gone. And, but so now we're getting back to it. So, so experiential knowledge, so just building on a platform. And so what I found with the series was that essentially what I've been sharing in the last few, episodes of this mini series really is, all fine and dandy. It's always nice to feel like you're on the right track and you're up to date with things. So that whole process of really focusing on the carbs, cutting the carbs low, getting enough protein to satisfaction, and then topping up with fat, but not too much fat. And then the micronutrients and the fasting. That's what we've talked about, basically. So that's all came through in the conference, and basically it just reconfirmed what we've been sharing. But what I wanted to go through is just get some bullet points that were really highlight, because every conference you find something new, and something that adds to the body of knowledge that helps you understand and appreciate the whole body of knowledge more. What I've done is instead of going through the whole 20-odd talks, it's actually 28 slides here, so there must have been 28 speakers. Instead of going through them in order, what I've done is I've chunked them into categories, so that, as you'll see, that we talk about one thing as we go through, like cholesterol, protein, fat, carbohydrates, all that kind of stuff. It's all chunked. I've categorized them in the way I'll share it. There's a cute talk with a guy called Nick Mailer. What I've also done is I've done this in a PowerPoint just to make it visible for me to actually share with you easily and not forget stuff as much. And what I'll do is I'll create this into a PDF and I'll put it below the Facebook Live post so you can actually see it. Welcome, Mandy. Hope New Zealand's treating you well. Sometimes I see who's watching and sometimes I see who isn't, depending on the system. So let's jump right into it. So, actually, I was talking about this guy, Nick Mailer. that's actually one talk I could have left behind, and it was really just the whole idea that we're so governed by our beliefs and how we see the world, and that's a big part of what I like talking about. But in terms of this context, you could have let go of that talk, but basically how you approach things makes all the difference. So being open to keep watching and watching your thoughts and how you're going through, and just being open is what I talked about last week, is being open and learning to accept what's real for you once you've done the exploration. Welcome, Kay. Actually, for some reason I didn't see who was coming on board on this last last talk on this system, but I am this time. I have got no idea what Facebook is doing there. So first up, let's talk about cholesterol. And cholesterol is a big issue because we've been frightened to death over it for decades. And there's a lot of misinformation about it, and most cardiologists are still in the dark ages about it, and that's tough to hear. But it's, sometimes you have to talk tough. And there was a guy, Dave Feldman. He's a software engineer, and he's got a site called cholesterolcode.com. I recommend you go on there and have a look at that, and that'll be in the PDF, so you can just click on the links and go through. But he's looking at the idea of remnant cholesterol. So when you take your total cholesterol and you take off your HDLs and your LDLs, then you're left with the remnant cholesterol. And so he says that's a better marker. It's one of those tests that you can run it through yourself. If you've got a blood test, you can take your total cholesterol, take your HDL and your LDL off, and see if you're in your teens, like in 10 to 20s or lower. I actually, when I redid mine, from the first time I did blood tests to the last time I did blood tests, which was a year ago, I think, I had dropped my remnant cholesterol by about a half with low carb, high fat diet and ketogenic diet. Still possibly a little high, but there's still more to be seen about that. It's something to look into and think about. I really like talk by David Diamond. He's a professor. He works in microbiology and a bunch of other things, and he was told he needed to get onto statins 8 years ago or something like that, and he didn't really want to do that. So he did a lot of research on it. You can see him on YouTube, David Diamond, a PhD, and basically what he does, he shows you how, if you've got cholesterol like my levels, is that you'll be told you've got familial hypercholesterolemia. So meaning your family has a lot of cholesterol in their blood. That's all the genetic kind of process with it. And when you look at the actual research, people with that live very happily into their 70s and 80s and longer. So it's really not the hypercholesterolemia that's the issue, and that's the whole issue that we're talking about here, is that cholesterol isn't really the bad guy. He's been likened to the fireman at the fire, and if it's a bigger fire, more firemen. So he's not a bad guy in and of himself. He's just part of the carrier system. And Dave Feldman talks about, and this other guy, Dave Diamond, he talks about what actually affects, like there's a subgroup of people with familial hypercholesterolemia. The ones that have high clotting factors mean that their blood clots easily, and that ties into, he wasn't at this conference, but ties into the idea I talked about with Dr. Malcolm Kendrick, Scottish GP, where he puts it down, the biggest factor is stress. And one of the things that stress does with the increased stress hormones is increases your clotting factors. So I think a lot of that's coming together now. And with the blood pressure issue, like Dr. Eric Westman thinks that the key issue with cholesterol problems and heart attacks and strokes and stuff like that is the blood pressure. And when you look at that, stress, blood pressure, all kind of things is tying in together there, rather than cholesterol as itself being an issue. Because people know that when they go from a high carb, low fat diet to a low carb, high fat diet, then the cholesterol numbers will increase. And so it's just knowing that that's not something to be tripped up or scary about. Some things that increase clot formation, if you're looking at having hypercholesterolemia, like if you're obese, if you've got metabolic syndrome, if you've got any degree of diabetes, if you've got high blood glucose, that's the diabetes thing, hypertension again, that subset of hypercholesterolemia where they genetically clot easier and faster. with, on top of the stress and stuff like that. Bacterial infection, psychological stress, advanced aging, and smoking. All of those things increase the buildup of clots. So it's those things more than the actual cholesterol is the issue. And so that's David Diamond. He did a real great talk on that. And Ivor Cummins, you may have heard of him. It's interesting that engineers are coming out a lot because engineers have a kind of brain where they can figure out problems and see what's happening and figure out what's going wrong. And they know how to look at things different to doctors do. And so Ivor Cummins is a great one. He's an Irish engineer, and he's got a site called thefatemperor.com based on that idea. The emperor has no clothes, that idea. And he's really big on the coronary artery score or the coronary artery cardiogram. And it's his site, the Irish Heart Disease Awareness site, it calls it the mammogram for the heart. And I know that mammograms are under debate now, so I don't know if mammogram for the heart is the best option for giving that a name or giving it a byline that'll stick in your mind. But it's basically the idea of, at some point, when you're 40 and above, getting a coronary artery score, and you can get that in Auckland, New Zealand. I know a bunch of you are listening from Auckland. So you just call up, do it privately. And the idea is to see where you're at. There's one thing to actually get the blood results and the ketone results and all that kind of stuff. It's another thing to see actually what's happening in your heart, particularly those heart blood vessels, because that's what knocks a lot of people off. But the idea isn't to stop there. Is to, if you have a bad score, the idea is to check it out. If you have a good score, if you've already moved to a low carb, high fat diet and you have a good score, then the idea is just keep doing what you're doing. If you have a bad score, the idea is to get better at doing what you're doing, and then do another score in 2 years' time, and to see if you've actually stabilized that plaque and actually helped it come down. So that's what you're looking for, is a progression, a positive progression in your coronary artery score. And there's a lot of people, and particularly Ivor, thinks that's one of the best tests to do in terms of looking after your heart and making sure that the things you are doing are actually doing the right things and moving in the right direction. So I think that's going to be a great test that's coming through as we go. That's cholesterol. Let's move into salt. A lot of people have an issue. We've been told that salt's bad for us. And I had to, if you've gone into low carb, high fat, and you get any muscle cramping and stuff like that, like I used to when I first made that transition, you have to increase your salt intake so it can fight against, again, what the beliefs you've been told to things about salt. And there is a move to actually push salt way even lower, down to a third or less of a teaspoon a day. But what they're seeing is that when you get the salt down that low, you actually increase the rate of heart attacks. So there's a lot of good research being done. A guy called Andrew Mente, who's looking at the Pure studies and a few other things. He's one of those number crunchers. Basically says that 3 to 6 grams of salt a day is perfect. And a simple way to do that is do it to taste. And if you've been used to a low salt diet because you've been trying to follow that guidelines, you may need to oversalt your food for a while to get to that point of finding out what your natural salt inclination is. Stephen Phinney, I love Stephen Phinney. He's in my favorite book, A New Diet, A New Atkins for a New You, but he's also got other books of his own on low carbohydrate eating. And he's working with a company called Virta Health. And if you've heard of that guy, Sammy, I forget his name, he's from Finland. He was the guy who, with his wife, rode from somewhere like San Diego, I think it was, to Hawaii, and broke all the records, low carb, ketogenic. And so he's an internet entrepreneur, and he's finally got Steve some financial backing, so Steve can do some real research, and real research. And they created a company called Virta Health, VIRTA health.com, and I'll talk more about the people involved in that as we go through. But one of the things he looks at as a medical doctor and a scientific researcher, he looks at the whole idea of how does beta hydroxybutyrate, that's the main ketone you produce in your blood when you get your carbohydrates low enough, how does it actually work? And they're looking at it, the whole idea is it actually will inhibits the gene expression. This is how it's called epigenetics. We used to think that your genes were your key factors, and what things happen in your body does govern eye color, hair color, stuff like that, height to a degree. But then how your body responds to things is called the epigenetics. So you feed your body a particular way, and then that'll change how your genes express. So that's the science of epigenetics. And beta-hydroxybutyrate, the main ketone that you produce when you get your carbs low, actually inhibits the inflammatory gene expression. So that's another way. There's lots of other ways that being in ketosis can limit inflammation in your body. And inflammation's implicated in CVDs like heart attacks, strokes, obesity, diabetes, metabolic syndrome. So it's a major thing they're looking at. If you look at the work of, oh gosh, if I could see, I can remember his name. He's a cardiologist. He works with a company whose supplements I work with now. And he saw when he just one day became conscious when he was looking inside, when he was doing a stent or whatever, he actually saw that the artery was inflamed, and that's where he really started to look at the inflammatory process behind blood vessel disease. And but basically Steve's saying here that there's no drug that's approved for chronic use that can deliver the same anti-inflammatory benefits without side effects. And to look at anti-inflammatory benefits, you can look at how your white blood cells come down over time, or your CRP, your C-reactive protein, comes down. That's all markers of inflammation. And if you don't go into low carb, high fat, then you'll actually drop those levels down, and that means that general inflammation in your body is lowering. But they can actually see now that beta-hydroxybutyrate actually decreases the amount of gene expression for inflammation. So as much as you're pushed to create inflammation, because it can be a good thing to be able to mount an inflammatory response, there's actually a point where we can actually reduce that. And that's one of the kind of big exciting things where you'll hear in a minute about life extension and things like that. Amber Hearn, she was one of the last speakers, and she's again some kind of engineer and a software or something like that. And she looked at the whole idea of ketosis being a natural state. Like it's good for us to know that babies go into ketosis a lot easier than adults. And the whole idea of ketosis being the whole process of giving us a natural, quote unquote, human advantage. And that what she's saying is that ketones are needed for brain development. When you look at it, the brain is, largely fat. And so the whole ketosis process is part of that whole thing. And so a larger brain needs ketones for fuel, and it decreases the oxidative stress. I always love to say that you'll actually reduce your own personal carbon footprint by being in ketosis by about 30%. So that means you personally are producing 30% less carbon dioxide. Although there's an issue now that they're going aside here, but they don't really think carbon dioxide is really the big issue, and that's just part of a normal process planet's going through. So it's another one of those things where science can be bought. So let's not go any further with that. But one of the fascinating things about Amber is she was low carb, high fat for a long time, and it really helped her handle her weight. She had been vegan, vegetarian, and then she shifted to zero carb. And there's a lot more talk now about the whole idea of going zero carb, just basically eating meat, fish, chicken, organ meats, eggs maybe, but it's more the meat-based diet. And she had bipolar. She was that would be an awful thing to have. I've met some people with that, and it's not really not fun. But she actually cured that in 2 weeks, going, zero carb. And that whole thing about being ketosis, she's got a great blog, and I've got that in the link there, but she's got a story of her own story in Zero Carb Zen, which is a good Zero Carb Zen site, and zero carb site. Again, Estelle, or I forget the name, sorry, I'm not good at thinking on my feet when I'm talking into a video with people listening, and unless I got that kind of information on my head. And that'll pull it in, because it's interesting that she did that, because there was another speaker called Georgia Ede, who I absolutely love, and she's a psychiatrist, and she was the first one I really got this idea that the problem with plants is they have no legs. And why is that a problem? It's a problem because they can't run away. You know, an animal can run away from you because it doesn't want to be, eaten, but a vegetable can't. So it actually develops things that actually affect you subtly, and sometimes not so subtly. But the whole thing of anti-nutrients and vegetables, and they just want to protect themselves, and they particularly want to protect their seeds. So, or the flower that creates the seeds. So those things can have more anti-nutrients than others. So it's just an interesting thing that we need to be aware of. And she talks about this herself. She's concerned about the high increase in amount of vegans and vegetarians around, particularly around young women, and because basically, they're not getting enough DHA, which is actually a food for the brain, and the developing brain with, kids, women getting pregnant and what they've got, feeding the baby and all that kind of stuff. So she's really big on that. But anyway, she's a psychiatrist, and she talked about how, she talked about how, there's an increasing prevalence of depression, of suicide, of anxiety disorders and dementia, and how that can be related to inflammation and oxidation. Then we get back to the whole idea of diet creating an inflammatory process in the body. And she says that, there's good associations, so it's not proof yet, but there's good associations that things like depression, ADD, ADHD, bipolar and schizophrenia are linked to and depression and bipolar disease linked to inflammation, and then depression, bipolar and schizophrenia and OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, linked to oxidation. So but basically what she's saying is if you can work with your diet, and she says elimination diets get to improvement in 62 to 82% of people, something like that. And if you had like insulin resistance, like bipolar and schizophrenia, like they have a 300, like in terms of their population of people, they are 300% more likely to be insulin resistant and diabetic than the general population. So it just goes to show that, again, there's that associational process where it's more likely that if you help them manage their blood sugars, they're going to have a bigger benefit. And Alzheimer's, they say that people with Alzheimer's have 80% of them, that's, 4/5 have either insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes. So, and that's why they're calling Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes now. So the blood sugar has such a big impact on us. And the rise of, the other thing she says about, remember I talked about stress affecting the arteries, and she says one of the things that when you get a rise of stress hormones, your blood sugar rises. So that's that blood sugar again impacting the blood vessels. And she says, if ketosis can be helpful in neurological disorders like Parkinson's, ALS, traumatic brain injury, multiple sclerosis, and epilepsy, why not in autism, bipolar disorder, psychosis, and Alzheimer's? So that whole process of, she had a really cute line on it. She said, well, last time I looked, the head was actually part of the body. So if you decrease inflammation, generally the head should benefit, right? Clearly what's in it. She did say there was some specific, this is one of the first speakers that started talking about micronutrients, which is, often you're in the low carb, high fat community, there's this avoidance of micronutrients. There's some starting to be coming out now where it's becoming to be more important. And she brought, looking at things like iron for dopamine synthesis, neurotransmitter synthesis, a lot of cell signaling inside the brain, zinc being converted to for serotonin and dopamine in certain degrees, iodine for brain growth, proper functioning of thyroid, and iron deficiency is associated with the main cause of brain damage in childhood. So just that whole thing of, it's not just what you're eating, but it's what's in the food that you're eating that can be a difference. There was a great couple of GPs from Canada. We're going with time. I'm trying to make this 30 minutes to cut it down, so I might run out of time and do another thing next week on that. So here we go. So, the two GPs from Canada talking about chronic pain, because they became low carb, high fat practitioners themselves, partly because of what they personally experienced, because they were both women, getting older, things needed to change, so they started to make some changes themselves. And they noticed that not just themselves, but a lot of their clients came back saying that they all of a sudden, those people with chronic pain noticed a lot less pain. And so they're looking at the actual mechanisms, how a low-carb, high-fat, ketogenic diet might actually decrease pain. And one of the, you may have guessed already, is that decrease in the anti-inflammatory pathways, so actually cutting down inflammation in the body. Pain is often a sign of inflammation in the body. There's mechanical advantages of being less heavy. The effects of ketone bodies themselves, do they have a specific effect? Effect on mitochondrial function. When you have your mitochondria working better, you're more energetic, so that helps you deal with pain levels better. And then the micronutrient strategies. Again, they brought in micronutrients, things like vitamin D, omega-3, riboflavin, CoQ10, glucosamine sulfate, probiotics, and other nutrients like B1s, the Bs, the B1, B2, folate, calcium amino acids, zinc, carnitine. So again, you're starting to see that micronutrient thing, and I think that'll become a much bigger part of low-carb conferences in the future, because it is a major issue. If the nutrients aren't in the soil, how on earth can they be in your food, even the good quality low-carb, high food you're eating? But chronic pain, it's a great thing a lot of people suffer chronically, and to help them change diet simply to address that. It doesn't, they say to manage your expectations, like I've talked about in my last talk. It's not that it'll go to 0%, but you'll, manage it. Being in massive pain is different to being in moderate or minor pain. It's a great talk by a neurologist. In terms of the medical profession, the neurologists have probably been more open-minded about low-carb, high-fat, ketogenic diet, largely because of the benefits they see in epilepsy. Now, not all forms of epilepsy are good with a low-carb diet, particularly if you've got like a ability. Some people don't have the ability to deal with carnitine as well, or produce it or use it, and then there's people with porphyria that it's really good not to be on a ketogenic diet. So they need to be careful with this if they've got epilepsy as well. But epilepsy, they started doing in the 1920s with kids, and then they found really benefit in epilepsy for kids. But then all the anti-epileptic drugs came in, and then all the switch went to that. And now in the 1990s, they're starting to bring back that ketogenic diet. And there's a couple of great sites, the Charlie Foundation from a kid called Charlie, and the ILAE, it's the International, for epilepsy anyway, but again, that'll be on the PDF. So lots of things happening in the neurological world, so they're very, very supportive, and we'll see a lot of more research coming out from them. Then there was a pediatric endocrinologist, and he's talking about type 1 diabetes, and because that's when kids get hit the most. The type 1s happen as kids, can happen as late as the 30s and 40s. But what they're finding is that the more insulin you have, the more insulin like you give a person over their lifetime, the more they're going to die of CVD, like heart attacks and strokes, type 1 and type 2. So the idea is to actually to get the insulin bolus down over a long period of time so that you decrease the risk. And he recommended Dr. Richard Bernstein if anyone's got diabetes. I've been recommending that for a while. A friend of mine who's got a diabetic husband introduced me to him. He's got a book called The Diabetes Solution, and he's got a whole university, because he's an amazing story in himself. Another engineer who turned into a doctor because he had type 1 diabetes and figured it out, and thought the doctors would listen to him, but they listened to him even less when he became a doctor. Sad testimony to my ex-profession. And fantastic guy to listen to. And that whole thing around decreasing the insulin by decreasing the sugar. Sarah Hallberg at Verta Health is part of that thing I talked about before with Stephen Finney and Sammy, forget his name, from Finland. And what they're finding is that basically, let's see if I can go through this. No, I'm going to probably stop here, because otherwise I'm going to shortchange you. I don't want to do that. So let's go back to, I'll just finish on this diabetes section, and then we'll wrap it up for the day. What she said is that basically you'll hear a lot of stories like the diabetes associations are giving us the wrong information. If you've got diabetes, you really want to not follow what the diabetes associations are telling us. And because they're actually going to make you. They believe that diabetes is a irreversible, intractable disease, meaning it's just going to get worse and worse and worse, and you're going to need more drugs, more interventions to handle that. And they lead people on that slippery track, because diabetes ruins your blood vessels. So anything that's fed by the blood vessels, you can imagine every organ in your body just disappears on you. You can lose them. We amputate more limbs, toes, digits through diabetes than anything else, because of the blood vessel disease in the periphery. So a lot of people on wheelchairs because they don't have any legs anymore. They go blind with retinopathy. The kidneys pack up, blood vessels in the kidneys pack up, so they need dialysis. It is a horrendous process to see someone go down that slippery slope, and the diabetes associations help it, because they manage things. They say you need a certain amount of sugar to help us deal with the insulin thing. So they basically increase the sugar content, the carbohydrate content in the diets, and they manage it with insulin. And it's really tough to manage sugar with more insulin. So the idea is that they haven't got yet, is to actually take the carbohydrates right out of the diet, and then insulin becomes more manageable. You decrease the inflammation, you decrease all the damage by the insulin, and because insulin is a master hormone. And so she says diet, things that they've looked at, and you've heard about them, the Mediterranean diet, the DASH diet, the plant-based diet. That whole focus on grains and plants and healthy whole grains really pushes people to the limit. And we really aren't designed to have that much of those things. But that's where the research has been coming from. And then what's fascinating about her is with Stephen Finney and Sammy, they're actually creating this whole body of, they're actually doing real research, and which are coming out, they'll drip feed it out as their research comes to fruition. And over the next few years, I think we'll see the diabetes associations really pick up their ears at that. And what they're showing, so they're coming up with really solid studies, and they're showing that there's a decreased weight. I think it was something like 80% of people going through their program either reduce or eliminate their drugs. That's pretty profound. There are HbA1c levels, which is a measure of glycated hemoglobin. What that means, when you when you have too much sugar in your blood, or any sugar in your blood, it happens automatically. A normal HbA1c is an interesting thing to think about. A normal HbA1c sits at around below 5. So that means that 5% of your, I think I've got this right, that 5% of the hemoglobin in your blood at any given moment doesn't work. Why? Because it's glycated. So when you have glucose and it sticks on a protein molecule, that's glycating that protein, and that protein can't function. It can't grasp things anymore. It's stuck. So the hemoglobin can't hold on to oxygen. That's, because it's got glucose in the way. And you can't take the glucose off. It's stuck. So the hemoglobin without glucose stuck to it can grab oxygen, but the hemoglobin with glucose stuck to it can't. And when you think about it, you hear about diabetics having low energy, and partly that's the mitochondrial effect. But the other part is that if you have 10%, like if you have a hemoglobin A1C of 10, that's 10% of your hemoglobin stuck with glucose, you can imagine that's going to cut down how much oxygen you have running around in your system, right? So so there you go. So HbA1c comes down to actually below normal. So not below normal, but into normal levels. So that means that all of a sudden they don't have that diabetic issue anymore. They actually can be called diabetes free. And so that's where you get to see diabetes is actually a reversible lifestyle disease, and rather than a chronic irreversible one that you're just stuck with. And so less and less drugs, more and more health. As I posted on Facebook yesterday, Asima Holter put on a post called, I think it was something like, "You can't drug people into health." It's just common sense, isn't it? And Sarah Hallberg is one of the Nutrition Coalition. You'll hear more about this in the next part of the talk. The Nutrition Coalition is that whole, there's a body of, Nina Teicholz is a major driver behind this. What they want to do is change how we how the authorities put out about nutrition, the nutrition guidelines, because we've been very good. We have actually followed the guidelines. When you look at it, we have actually done what they've said to do. And we've done it so well, but we've got so sick because of it. So the idea is that because we're that kind of people, we'd like to do what's right in general. We need, her thought, and I fully support this, is we need to change the nutrition guidelines so that all of a sudden people can go, I can stop eating that. Oh, I can eat that. Just relaxes the mind, because it's too much stress to think about what to eat, isn't it? Adds to that whole inflammatory process. So that whole thing around really spearheading a focus to change those guidelines, and there's a guidelines happening in 2020. That's when the next change is happening, and so hopefully by then we'll see this all come to a point where we can actually move ahead in a real direction this time. So so there you go. There's a half a summary of the Breckenridge conference. I trust that's been useful for you. I'll finish that off next week. Next week I will be in Russia, in St. Petersburg. So I need to figure out timing to do that. I think this time should work. I'll see. Well, I've been stable for 3 months in Finland, and now I'm going to be traveling for the next several months. So I'll look at maintaining the series up, and probably once I've got through this next piece, I'll shorten the pieces up to handle specific issues. Things like constipation. I had a question about measuring your ketones and things like that. So I want to get those out, but I'll do those in separate little chunks. And but thanks for being on. Thanks for listening. I saw Kay. I see you asking a question: is salt better than others? Well, it depends on who you listen to. Like everything else, iodized salt's often a favourite for people because we're low in iodine. I'm a favourite of Celtic sea salt and I don't know. Well, 2 reasons. I think sea salt is better than Himalayan because there's more all the nutrients have come out of the down from the Himalayas and everywhere else and gone into the sea. So I think the sea has a better compilation. And there's different kinds of Celtic sea salt you can get. That some are richer in minerals than others. So being born on the North Sea in Scotland, North Scotland, Celtic sea salt is my favourite. But I've heard plenty of people in the field say that iodized salt is just as good. So you have to play with that. So next week I'll go through the rest of this, and if you have any questions, drop them in the things below, and I'll do my best to answer those either next week or in part of that follow-up series. Thanks again for listening, everyone. Have a great weekend and a great week with everything.